Imagine you are an architect, right? And you've spent your entire life just studying the great historical buildings of the world.
Okay, I can picture that.
Yeah, and one day you get this amazing opportunity. You're given the chance to lay out the sacred blueprints of the major world religions just side by side on this massive table.
Oh, wow. That is quite the visual.
It is, right. So you unroll the first blueprint, the one representing the older traditions, and you see these incredible, massive, load-bearing walls.
The foundational stuff.
Exactly. You see this very specific, sweeping archway. You see a deeply complex foundation system that's designed to hold up the entire structure.
Right, the architecture of the faith itself.
Yeah, exactly. But then you unroll the second blueprint, the newer one. You look down and, well, there are those exact same load-bearing walls, the same sweeping archway, the exact same foundation system. And, human nature being what it is, your brain immediately fires off a very specific assumption.
I mean, the immediate reflex is to assume the second builder just, walked into the first builder's office in the dead of night.
Right.
Rolled up the plans, snuck out, and passed them off as their own original work.
It feels like a completely open and shut case of intellectual theft. You don't even really need to think about it. It just feels obviously true.
It's a very natural human conclusion to jump to.
And when you look at the Bible and then you look at the Qur'an, you are immediately hit with that exact same sensation, this massive, undeniable overlap.
You definitely are.
I mean, you're reading about the same ancient prophets. You're walking through the exact same historical narratives.
The same moral vocabulary, too.
Exactly. And for centuries, a very rigid narrative has been built entirely around that overlap.
Yeah, a narrative asserting that the later text is essentially nothing more than a derivative copy.
A copy.
Right. Maybe a slightly confused copy of the earlier text, but a copy nonetheless.
So today we have this stack of incredibly rich source material in front of us. We're looking at excerpts from this really fascinating essay.
It's titled The Qur'an as Guardian, Beyond the Allegation of Plagiarism.
And our mission for this deep dive is to tackle this whole concept head on. We are going to unpack one of the most common, enduring claims made by Christian and Jewish polemicists throughout history.
The idea that the Qur'an is just a rewritten, repackaged version of the Bible.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to be very clear with you listening right now. Our goal here is not to take theological sides.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to tell you which blueprint is the true one. Our goal is to rigorously, objectively examine the actual logic of this plagiarism accusation.
And to see how the Qur'an actually defines its own relationship to those earlier texts, which is super important.
Yeah, it really is. And I think we need to talk about why this matters to you, the listener, because it goes way beyond just, ancient theology.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are living in an era entirely defined by information overload.
Deep fakes, generative AI.
Right? Constant allegations of fake news or stolen intellectual property. We are bombarded every single day with the task of evaluating media authenticity.
So true.
So understanding how to differentiate between cheap plagiarism, the reality of shared source material, and this much more complex concept of corrective continuity.
I love that phrase, corrective continuity.
Yeah, it's a fundamental critical thinking skill. It trains you to look at two things that appear identical on the surface and force yourself to ask deeper questions.
Questions about their structural relationship, right? Their intent.
Exactly, and the power dynamics at play between them.
But before we get to all that nuance, we kind of have to start where the critic starts. We have to acknowledge why this plagiarism claim sounds so incredibly believable at first glance.
The source text calls this superficial plausibility. And it's a very powerful force.
It is. I mean, if you sit down and open the Qur'an for the first time, you aren't stepping into some alien sci-fi landscape.
No, you're immediately running into Adam and Noah.
You're reading these extensive chapters about Abraham and Moses. You're encountering Mary and Jesus.
The cast of characters is just overwhelmingly familiar to anyone who has had even a passing brush with the Judeo-Christian tradition.
You don't need a new glossary to figure out who these people are.
Right. And the vocabulary is just as familiar. We are talking about deep structural concepts here.
Like sin and divine guidance.
Yes, a final cataclysmic judgment, paradise, hell, the moral fate of entire nations. It's all there.
So, to someone who is just casually flipping through the text, or maybe a historian looking at it from 30,000 feet, the conclusion feels obvious.
They look at it and say, well, this is clearly just biblical religion retold in Arabic.
Maybe tailored for a desert audience with a slightly different flavor.
Yeah, and that assumption is exactly where the analytical trap snaps shut.
The trap. Let's talk about that, because the source text does a phenomenal job dissecting this massive logical leap critics make.
They move directly, without any friction at all, from the observation of similarity to the definitive conclusion of borrowing.
But logically speaking, shared content simply does not automatically equate to fraud.
It really doesn't.
Let's ground this in a modern example. It's like accusing a modern history textbook, published in 2024, of plagiarizing a history textbook from 1955.
Right, just because they both feature long chapters on World War II.
Exactly. They both talk about Winston Churchill and the Normandy landings, but overlap is functionally required if both books are attempting to describe the exact same underlying reality.
You wouldn't throw the modern book in the trash and call it a fraud just because it mentions D-Day.
Of course not. You'd say, well, D-Day was a real event, so any accurate history book is obligated to mention it.
And the mechanics of that analogy map perfectly onto the theological argument the Qur'an is making.
How so?
Well, if a central objective spiritual reality exists, if there actually is a creator who has been communicating with humanity throughout history,
Right.
then any subsequent text claiming to address that reality must, by definition, intersect with the previous descriptions of it.
If it didn't intersect, you'd have a much stronger reason to doubt it.
Exactly. If it came out of nowhere with completely different information, that would be highly suspicious.
Okay, wait, I'm stuck on something here, and I want to push back a bit on behalf of a skeptic who might be listening.
Sure, go for it.
The history textbook analogy works because World War II is an objective event we all agree happened.
Right.
But in the realm of religion and textual history, the Bible was culturally established for centuries before the Qur'an arrived. It was the dominant cultural force in late antiquity.
It absolutely was.
So doesn't it just make logical sense for a historian or a casual observer to default to the older, established text as the baseline? Why shouldn't we use the older text as the standard to measure the new one?
See, that is the crux of the entire historical debate. And the source text addresses this directly. It calls this the lens of inherited Christian certainty.
Inherited Christian certainty.
Yes. The argument you just outlined, that the older text must be the unquestionable baseline, it contains a massive hidden circularity.
Walk me through that.
It fundamentally assumes that the current biblical canon, the exact physical texts held by the Jewish and Christian communities back in late antiquity, is pristine.
That it's perfectly complete.
Right. It assumes those texts constitute the flawless, objective standard of truth.
So it assumes the very thing it's trying to use as proof.
Exactly. It uses the Bible as the flawless yardstick to measure the Qur'an, and then naturally finds the Qur'an wanting, or derivative, simply because it differs from that yardstick.
But the source points out that taking the Bible as a flawless, neutral starting point is a problem.
A huge problem, historically and theologically, if you're trying to understand the Qur'an's perspective. Because the Qur'an's entire foundational premise is a direct dispute of that exact assumption.
It's disputing the yardstick itself.
Yes. The Qur'an doesn't deny that previous revelation happened. It affirms that the Torah and the Gospel were real, divine communications.
Okay, so what is it denying then?
What it denies is the final integrity of the later human custody over those revelations.
Ah, so the critic is saying, you don't match the benchmark, therefore you are a flawed, clumsy copy.
Right.
And the Qur'an is looking right back and saying, I am not trying to match your benchmark because your benchmark has been broken by centuries of human interference.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And only by completely ignoring the Qur'an's own explicitly stated premise can this slogan, the Qur'an is a plagiarized Bible, seem intellectually persuasive.
You have to literally ignore what the text says it's doing to accuse it of doing something else.
You do, because the Qur'an views that baseline as compromised. Its entire mission completely changes. It isn't trying to align with the late antiquity religious environment.
It's trying to disrupt it.
Yes, completely disrupt it.
And if we want to understand how it does that, we really have to look at how the Qur'an views its own origins, which leads us into territory that's kind of counterintuitive.
Very counterintuitive to how we normally think about the birth of new religious movements.
Yeah, because one of the most astonishing things the source text brings to light is how critics completely glide past a very basic fact proclaimed within the text itself.
The fact that the Qur'an never, at any point, presents itself as inventing a new religion from scratch.
Which is wild. Think about the mechanics of starting a cult or inventing a religion to get political power in the ancient world. The standard playbook relies heavily on novelty.
You'd want to bring something wholly unfamiliar to the market.
Exactly, to separate your followers from the mainstream. You introduce unknown mystical prophets. You claim secret knowledge that only you possess.
You might even introduce a completely unrelated revolutionary concept of the creator.
Because you want to isolate your followers in a brand new paradigm, so they rely entirely on you.
But the Qur'an fiercely and repeatedly rejects novelty in that crude sense. The source points to several specific verses to illustrate this.
Like which ones?
Well, verse 42.13 insists that God has ordained for the listeners the exact same religion that was enjoined upon Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
The exact same religion.
And verse 21.92 bluntly states that the messages given to all these historical prophets, all the way down to Muhammad, belong to one single unbroken divine current.
One single divine current.
The text explicitly says, indeed, this religion of yours is one religion.
Okay, let's play out a hypothetical scenario here. Imagine if the Quran had arrived in 7th century Arabia with an entirely different cast of characters.
Okay.
Imagine completely ignored Abraham, never mentioned Moses, skipped over Jesus entirely, and instead it introduced this alien moral universe with a completely different cosmological history.
That would have completely undermined its own core premise.
Right.
If a text claims to be the final message from the exact same universal God that has spoken to humanity since the dawn of time, but it brings completely unrecognizable stories.
Any rational critic would tear that apart.
They'd say, wait a minute, why did your eternal, unchanging God suddenly change his entire vocabulary, forget all his previous messengers, and start from scratch?
The irony there is just staggering. Critics attack the Quran for not being original, using its lack of novelty as their primary proof of fraud.
When in reality,
the Quran is essentially standing in the public square shouting, I'm not trying to be original. Originality would mean I'm making this up right now.
Exactly. It views its continuity not as an embarrassment to be swept under the rug, but as the ultimate necessary proof of its legitimacy.
Proof that it belongs in that single divine current.
Yes. But we have to draw a very sharp line here between the messages and the communities.
Okay, distinguish those for us.
The Quran claims absolute, unbroken continuity with the original messages given to those ancient prophets. But its relationship with the communities that currently hold those messages, the tribes and empires of late antiquity, is entirely different.
So it says the origin is the same, but the current state of those communities' texts is not.
Right, because the origin being the same doesn't mean that custody has been perfectly maintained.
And this forces us to look at the actual behavior of the text when it interacts with the Jewish and Christian communities of its day.
If we are going to act as detectives investigating a historical charge of plagiarism, we need to understand the psychology of a plagiarist.
How does someone who is stealing intellectual property actually behave?
Well, the source text builds a very compelling behavioral profile of a plagiarist. Fundamentally, a plagiarist is a dependent creature.
Because they need the source material.
They borrow from a source because they desperately need its authority, its structure, or its content to prop themselves up. And because of that dependence, they usually try to conceal the borrowing.
Make it look like their own.
Right. Or if they're borrowing so heavily that they can't conceal it, they try very hard not to antagonize the source tradition. They flatter it.
They try to weave themselves into the existing narrative without causing a disruption.
Because if the source tradition completely rejects them, the plagiarist's entire foundation crumbles.
Let's go back to high school for a second. A plagiarist is the student sitting in the back row, quietly copying your homework, sweating bullets.
Just hoping the teacher doesn't notice the identical answers.
Exactly. They are timid. They are trying to fly under the radar. The absolute last thing that student is going to do is stand up in the middle of class, walk over to your desk, and loudly critique your handwriting and your math skills to the rest of the room.
That would be a terrible strategy. And the Qur'an behaves in the exact opposite manner of that sweating student.
It does.
It does. To explain this, the source introduces a vital Arabic concept found in verse 5.48. It's the concept of muhaymin.
Muhaymin. Break down the mechanics of that word for us.
It carries the meaning of a guardian, an overseer, a controller, or a criterion.
Okay.
The Qur'an openly announces its historical continuity with the Torah and the Gospel. It actually states that it was sent down confirming what came before it.
But it doesn't do this with timid flattery.
No. It speaks with what the source text brilliantly describes as a commanding independence.
So it's entirely devoid of flattery toward the source communities.
Entirely.
Yeah.
While it confirms the reality of the original revelations, it simultaneously delivers blistering structural rebukes to the members of the people of the book, the contemporary Jewish and Christian communities.
Blistering rebukes, like what?
It accuses their scholars and leaders of distorting words from their proper places. It accuses them of deliberately concealing the truth for worldly gain.
Wow.
It accuses them of writing scriptures with their own hands and then falsely claiming, this is from God. It fiercely rebukes them for taking their rabbis and monks as lords besides God.
Okay, so if we update that homework analogy, the Qur'an isn't the nervous student in the back row at all.
Not even close.
The Qur'an is acting like the original teacher who suddenly kicks the door open, walks to the front of the room, picks up the student's homework and says, okay, you got the first half right, you remembered the basic formula, but you completely botched the ending.
You misunderstood the core concept.
And frankly, you've scribbled self-serving nonsense in the margins to make yourself look better. Let me show you the original answer key.
That is exactly it. That is not a timid borrower. That is someone claiming the absolute authority of a final, unassailable judge.
The source text highlights how deeply uncomfortable, even offensive, this posture must be for critics.
Both in late antiquity and today, because the Qur'an is marching directly into their highly protected religious archives.
It honors their most sacred prophets.
Sometimes revering figures like Jesus or Moses even more fiercely than the source traditions themselves do.
But it absolutely refuses to grant those communities a monopoly over those prophets.
It does not enter the archive to passively inherit the tradition. It enters the archive to interrogate it, to dismantle the additions, and to reclaim the core.
Interrogate it. That's powerful. I think to really grasp the sheer sociological shock value of this interrogation, we can't just talk in abstract terms. We have to look at specific case studies.
The source material provides two massive paradigm-shifting examples of this.
Because it isn't just retelling the stories with different names, it's actively, surgically reshaping them.
It's compressing and reorienting inherited stories to bring them back to their absolute moral and metaphysical core. And the first example it tackles is Abraham.
Abraham, the patriarch. I mean, he is essentially the foundational cornerstone for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim self-understanding.
He is. But we have to look at how he was treated in the biblical and post-biblical traditions leading up to the 7th century.
Okay, set the scene.
Over centuries of interpretation, Abraham became deeply entangled in complex ethnic, genealogical, and covenantal claims.
Right.
Later communities used their literal, physical descent from Abraham to ground their own chosenness, their historical privilege, and their exclusive legitimacy.
Massive political and theological architectures were built on the idea that exclusive divine rights flowed directly and only through his bloodline.
Yes, in late antiquity, bloodlines were currency. Being able to trace your lineage back to Abraham wasn't just a fun fact for a family tree.
It was a claim to political power, to divine favor, to being the sole inheritors of God's promise.
It became a story fundamentally about tribal belonging and exclusion.
So how does the Qur'an handle that?
The Qur'an looks at that massive, tangled, exclusionary superstructure and simply takes a theological scalpel to it.
A scalpel.
The source quotes verse 3.67, which cuts through centuries of tradition with stunning directness. It states, Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was one inclining toward truth, a submitter to God, and he was not of the idolaters.
The audacity of that statement in that historical context is incredible.
It's an act of total theological reclamation. The Quran is not merely copying the character of Abraham from the Bible and giving him a respectful nod to win over the local tribes.
It's actively reclaiming him from the later sectarian identities that had essentially tried to trademark him.
Exactly. It strips away the tribal ownership and restores him to the status of a primordial monotheist. It's arguing that Abraham's primary allegiance belongs to God, long before it belongs to any later religious tribe, empire, or ethnic lineage.
Think about the marketing strategy there. If you're a plagiarist trying to win over the powerful Jewish and Christian communities in Arabia,
walking up to them and telling them that their foundational exclusive patriarch actually doesn't belong to them at all is a terrible PR move.
Terrible. You're stripping away the very privilege and political power they built around him. You are looking at the most powerful people in the room and saying, your greatest asset isn't yours.
That is not the behavior of someone copying to fit in. That is the behavior of someone dismantling a power structure.
Wow. And the second case study the source provides regarding Jesus is even more intense, isn't it?
The treatment of Jesus in the Quran is perhaps the most dramatic, undeniable evidence against the simplistic plagiarism charge.
Because if it were merely the Bible rewritten, as the critics claim, you'd expect one of two very common historical things to happen.
Right. Either it would reject Jesus altogether, the way a new rival sect often demonizes the favored figure of another tradition to establish its own dominance. Or, if it were truly dependent on Christian material, in a passive, copying way, it would absorb the massive Christological framework of the Byzantine Church. It would adopt the theology along with the character.
It would bring the whole package.
It brings neither the rejection nor the whole package.
It threads the needle.
Yes. It affirms the virgin birth with incredible seriousness. It affirms that Jesus is the Messiah. It affirms his miracles, like healing the blind and raising the dead.
It honors him.
It honors him with titles, calling him a word from God and a spirit from him. But at the exact same time, it aggressively and systematically strips away the massive theological superstructure that the Byzantine Church had spent the last 4 centuries building around him.
It takes a hammer to the Trinity.
It directly and unequivocally denies that he is God. It denies that he is the literal or ontological Son of God. It completely rejects the complex Trinitarian formulas that defined late antiquity Christianity.
And it doesn't just make these denials in the abstract, right?
No, it repeatedly places the pure, unadulterated prophetic call to worship God alone directly onto the lips of Jesus himself.
Oh, wow.
Verse 572 specifically says, "They have certainly disbelieved who say, 'God is the Messiah, Son of Mary.' While the Messiah said, 'O children of Israel, worship God my Lord and your Lord.'"
I can hear a modern critic responding to this, though. They might look at the history of the 7th century and say, well, Muhammad lived in an environment where he interacted with various merchants, traveling monks, maybe some heretical Christian sects.
Right, he heard the story.
He heard these stories about Jesus, but he was an outsider. He just didn't fully grasp the immense philosophical complexities of the Trinity or the nuances of the hypostatic union, so he just simplified it or muddled it together out of historical ignorance.
That is a very common, almost patronizing defense mechanism from critics, but the source text directly counters it. The counter-argument relies on observing the sheer internal consistency of the text. The divergences from Jewish and Christian theology in the Qur'an are far too coherent, far too targeted to be the result of random confusion.
Or a sloppy memory, or half-heard stories from passing merchants.
Exactly. It's not a scattershot of random errors.
It's a targeted operation.
It is a highly deliberate, philosophically focused uncoupling of the prophets from the sectarian identities that had absorbed them.
So it's not misunderstanding the complex theology of late antiquity.
It understands it perfectly well, and it is systematically dismantling it. It separates the true, historical, prophetic Jesus from the imperial, theological superstructure built around him by the church.
Just like it separates Abraham from the ethnic chosenness built around him by the tribes.
Yes. There's a deep, functional mechanism at play here. This deliberate coherence leads us to a broader realization about the Qur'an's overarching theological goal.
Because we aren't just looking at a text that wants to fix historical timelines or correct the spelling of ancient names.
No, it's targeting a very specific, deeply ingrained flaw in human sociology and religious practice.
The Qur'an's corrections, its reclamations of these figures, they don't move in random directions. They move in one clear, consistent, relentless direction.
The core, unyielding objective is always the restoration of Tawhid.
Absolute divine oneness.
Yes, restoring that to the very center of reality.
And everything else, every single correction serves that singular restoration.
Every single one. To restore that absolute divine oneness, the text must dismantle everything human beings have built over centuries to mediate, control, or hoard that divine connection.
Because humans love to place intermediaries everywhere.
They do. So you see a consistent, brutal dismantling of priestly mediation in the Qur'an. You see a refusal of bloodline entitlement. You see the absolute rejection of the deification of prophets.
And a relentless exposure of religious hypocrisy among the scholar castes.
It's challenging the entire socio-political power structure of late antiquity religion.
It's taking aim at the gatekeepers.
It absolutely is taking aim at the gatekeepers.
Mm.
Verse 9.31 points out a devastating sociological truth, stating that communities took their rabbis and monks as lords besides God.
Wow!
And verse 4.171 commands the people of the book not to go to excess in their religion. It is systematically removing the spiritual monopoly of the very clerics who held all the power.
Which brings us right back to the absurdity of the plagiarism claim. Think of this in modern corporate terms, right?
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine an employee steals a highly confidential pitch deck from a massive, powerful rival corporation because they want to start their own firm. They copy the slides.
Right.
The very next day, they walk right into the rival corporation's boardroom, hand the copied deck back to the CEO and the board of directors and say, I used your template, but by the way, you are all corrupt.
Oh, man.
You've hoarded the company's wealth, your fundamental business model is a distortion of the founder's vision, and you are entirely unfit to lead. It is an insane strategy.
You don't copy someone's sacred text to gain legitimacy and then immediately attempt to destroy the legitimacy of the very people you copied it from.
The sociological mechanism here is key. A plagiarist always absorbs the worldview of the source. They have to make the forgery convincing and to benefit from the existing structure.
But the Qur'an repeatedly confronts and shatters the worldview that had grown around these traditions. It refuses to let revelation remain imprisoned inside tribal or sectarian possession.
It universalizes submission to God, stripping away the exclusivity that the tribes and empires relied on.
It's almost as if the Qur'an views religion, as it was institutionalized and practiced by these late antiquity communities, as the very cage trapping the original revelation.
The cage trapping the revelation, that is a brilliant way to phrase it.
And to achieve this massive course correction, to break that cage, the Qur'an has to establish a fundamental philosophical difference between what God actually sends down to humanity and what human beings ultimately do with it once it arrives.
This brings us to a profound distinction outlined in the source text, the stark difference between revelation and religion.
We use those words interchangeably today.
We do. Someone might say, my religion is based on revelation. But the source text draws a hard line between them. Walk us through that mechanism.
In the Quranic framework, they represent two entirely different phases of the spiritual process. Revelation is what is sent. It is the raw, pure, divine communication.
It begins in absolute purity because it comes from God.
Exactly. But religion in the sense of historical tradition, institutional structure, and accumulated dogma is what human beings construct over time. It is the human custody of that revelation.
And the fundamental tragic premise of the Quran is that human custody is inherently, inevitably vulnerable.
Humans mess things up. It's the ultimate rule of group projects.
Yes. Over a long enough timeline, the original instructions get lost, altered, or weaponized.
Communities do not remain pure simply because they were lucky enough to receive a revelation 1,000 years ago. The Quran outlines a very realistic sociology of religion.
What does that look like?
Over centuries, communities forget. They conceal parts of the message that are politically inconvenient or challenge their wealth. They divide into warring sects.
They exaggerate the status of their historical leaders to gain leverage over rivals.
Yes, they twist the religion to serve worldly power, identity politics, and class interests.
The text doesn't just imply this, it points to specific historical behaviors, right?
It calls them out explicitly. Verse 2.79 says, "So woe to those who write the book with their own hands, and then say, this is from God, to exchange it for a small price."
Writing the book with their own hands.
And verse 2.75 speaks of a group who heard the words of God and then deliberately distorted them after understanding them.
These aren't just minor historical complaints about typos.
No, this is the Qur'an's foundational theology of religious history. It is diagnosing the human condition.
So the Quran is essentially arguing that the pristine Torah, as given to Moses thousands of years ago on the mountain, it is not identical to the later, highly complex, rabbinic interpretive constructions that existed in late antiquity academies.
Right. And the pure gospel given to Jesus is not identical to the massive, politically intertwined theological architecture of the Byzantine Empire that formalized things like the Trinity at the Council of Nicaea.
Revelation is divine, but custody is human. And what is human is vulnerable to corruption, to political pressure, and to the sheer weight of time.
This opens up a fascinating avenue regarding how we view the historical sources themselves. Because modern secular critics have evolved past just saying the Quran copied the canonical Bible.
The source material notes this. They often point to Syriac Christian lore or Jewish apocryphal tradition.
Or even just oral folklore circulating in the Middle East at the time.
Right. A critic might say, look, there's a story in the Quran about Jesus speaking from the cradle or making clay birds come to life. Those stories aren't in the canonical Bible.
But they are in the infancy gospel of Thomas, or in Arabic infancy gospels that were floating around.
Exactly. So the critic concludes, the Quran is clearly just a composite, a sloppy mashup of whatever religious influences and fairy tales were blowing across the desert sands.
How does the text's framework handle that level of critique?
Yeah, how does it?
It handles it by applying the exact same theological lens we've been discussing. First, we have to recognize the reality of oral cultures in late antiquity. Motifs, stories, and historical fragments were shared widely across borders.
That is simply how human history works.
But crucially, from the Qur'an's perspective, fragments of genuine revelation can and do survive outside of official, institutionalized canonical structures.
Oh, that's an important point.
Just because a story was rejected by Byzantine council and labeled apocryphal doesn't mean every single element of it is false. It might contain a surviving ember of an original prophetic reality that the institutional church discarded.
So, the Quran isn't afraid of overlapping with folklore or unapproved texts either. It doesn't view the Byzantine Church's stamp of approval as the sole measure of truth.
No, because it does not passively absorb this apocryphal lore any more than it passively absorbs the canonical Bible. Let's look at the clay birds example you brought up.
Okay, let's look at that.
In the apocryphal infancy gospels, Jesus is often depicted as a child prodigy, using magic to impress people or even punish other children. It reads like folklore.
That bit magical, yeah.
The Quran takes that specific floating tradition of the clay birds, but it places it under the exact same severe, clarifying theological horizon of Tawhid.
What does it change?
It includes the story of Jesus shaping the clay, but it meticulously, deliberately adds the phrase, by my permission, meaning by God's permission.
Oh, it neuters the folklore of its problematic elements.
It strips away the metaphysical confusion. It ensures that Jesus is not seen as an independent deity performing independent magic, but as a prophet acting strictly under the power and permission of the one God.
It acts as the muhaimin, the criterion, over the folklore as well.
It separates the divine sign from the human embellishment. It's not a sloppy mashup. It is an incredibly disciplined theological filtration system.
It's running every single piece of late antiquity history through the absolute filter of monotheism.
And the Quran is so supremely confident in its internal coherence while doing this that it actually challenges the readers on a literary and structural level.
It issues a challenge.
Yes. Verse 4.82 issues a direct challenge. Then do they not reflect upon the Quran? Had it been from other than God, they would have found within it much contradiction.
It's daring the critic to find the seams.
It's essentially saying if this were a sloppy, opportunistic mashup of canonical texts, rejected apocrypha, and desert folklore, it would be full of contradictions, shifting theological loyalties, and structural errors.
But it isn't. It's fiercely, relentlessly unified around that single core principle of Tawhid.
And it issues an even broader challenge in verse 17.88, stating that even if mankind and the jinn gathered together to produce something like this Qur'an, they could not do it.
It presents itself not as a cautious, defensive borrower trying to hide its tracks, but as an irreducible, unassailable sign.
You can, of course, reject that theological claim, but as the source text notes, you are obligated to confront it on its own terms. You cannot just reduce it to the lazy, intellectually dishonest slogan of plagiarism.
When you lay out the mechanics of it like this, we have completely reframed the starting premise of this entire deep dive.
We really have.
We started with the assumption of the critic that we were looking at a clumsy, rewritten Bible, a second blueprint stolen from the first. But through unpacking this source material, we've seen that we are actually looking at something far more radical.
Far more structurally complex and, frankly, far more intellectually challenging.
The phrase the Quran is basically the Bible rewritten is, as the text ultimately concludes, not a serious historical or literary conclusion.
It is a defensive reflex.
A psychological shield used to avoid dealing with the uncomfortable, disruptive reality of what the Quran is actually doing to those older traditions.
The Quran is functioning as a final, unapologetic divine scrutiny over a fractured, deeply humanized religious inheritance.
It's acting as the guardian.
It affirms continuity where the truth remains intact, but it ruthlessly, surgically tears away the corruption where human power, habit, politics, and tribalism have interfered over the centuries.
And for you listening, this framework completely changes how you can read historical texts, or really how you consume any media that references older material.
It trains you to look past the superficial similarities.
When you see two things that look alike, whether it's ancient scripture, a modern political speech, or a piece of journalism, you don't just stop at asking, did one copy the other?
You have to ask, what is the later text doing with the material it references?
Are they imitating it to borrow its power? Or are they judging it? Are they leaning on the source for authority, or are they deliberately dismantling the source's authority to make a new corrective point?
It elevates your critical reading from simply spotting overlapping vocabulary to analyzing profound structural intent.
Exactly. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed about the vulnerability of human history.
Okay, lay it on us.
The source text mentions verse 15.9 of the Qur'an, where it makes a massive defining claim about itself. God says, "Indeed, it is we who sent down the reminder, and indeed, we will guard it."
A huge claim.
Now think about the immense tension here. The Quran builds its entire sweeping historical argument on the premise that human beings inheritably corrupt, distort, and politicize divine revelation over time.
It states categorically that human custody is inherently fundamentally fragile.
That is the established rule of human history according to the text. Yet it also claims about itself that it will be the permanent, miraculous exception to that exact rule of human nature.
It claims divine guardianship over its own text, promising it will never suffer the fate of the Torah or the Gospel.
So if the historical rule is human corruption, what does it truly mean for a text to claim it will be the permanent exception? When push comes to shove in the real world, does a text ultimately guard the community from corruption, or does the community inevitably have to guard the text?
That is the ultimate enduring question of religious history right there.
Think back one last time to those 2 blueprints for the cathedral. Once you know what to look for, once you understand the mechanics of what the second builder was actually doing, you realize they weren't trying to steal the design at all.
They were trying to show you exactly where the first builder had built the walls crooked,
where the foundation had cracked under the weight of human politics, and how to finally perfectly make the structure sound. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been an incredibly expansive conversation.
It really has, and we hope it gave you a powerful new lens to look at some very old, very important arguments. We'll see you next time.